The night Marco Rivera nearly returned a man's life by accident began with the smell of fries and wet pavement, and the simple, private economics of a city that never felt sorry for anyone. He had been driving his cab for 7 years, the vinyl seat a permanent map of his hours, the meter a metronome that dictated whether his mother would get chemo that month or whether the landlord would stop calling. He was a small man with a large jaw and a soft way of saying I'm sorry when he wanted to sound tougher. Tonight the meter clicked toward midnight, and the city was a slow breath, streetlights like tired watches, a subway grumbling under the feet of the borough. He picked up a passenger at a marble-paneled hotel on the edge of Brooklyn, a man with a coat that swallowed light and a presence that made other people in the lobby move a half step aside. Marco recognized the silhouette by instinct before he read the name. The kind of man your neighbors would watch on TV in the mornings and then pretend they'd never seen. He kept his head down, thanked the guest for sharp bills, and drove. "You forgot this," Marco said later, more than an hour from the hotel, when the man leaned across the back seat finally to retrieve his watch from where it had slipped between the cushions. Marco handed him a medallion instead, cold metal on his palm, a tarnished oval with a tiny photograph under glass. It was not the boss's wallet. The man's eyes flicked, the practiced calm of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where nothing surprised him. But the photograph in the medallion was a child. A girl with hair like sunburnt wheat and a freckle at the corner of her lip. The man's fingers went to the medallion faster than the watch, and for a fraction of a second, his face crumpled in a way Marco had only seen on broken policemen and museum statues. He smiled, but the smile did not reach the eyes. "Thanks," he said. Marco drove away, unaware he had just held someone else's hand on the fuse that would soon light his life. The medallion was warm and heavy in Marco's palm. It smelled like old skin and stories. He had found it under the seat where a woman had been, an hour earlier. A sobbing mother in a coffee-stained blouse who had left the back door open and the baby monitor on and had gone back into the hotel without paying. Marco had helped her with the stroller, joked about city life, and when she ran back the street to find the stroller seat had been reduced to a question mark, he tucked the medallion into his pocket. He never intended to meet the man from the hotel. He certainly had no intention of calling him sir. He was a taxi driver, not a hero. He was hungry for tips and for breathing room. But the medallion wouldn't let him keep the distance he was paid to keep. The second time the boss came into his life, it came with the glassy, polite tone of someone used to owning favors. A week later, after a late shift and 3 nights on a ventilator of coffee, Marco turned a corner and found his cab waiting with a flat tire and a note tucked beneath the wiper. "We need to talk." The note had an address in Jersey, a voicemail number with a corrupt joy that made his skin tighten. He thought about ignoring it and about how his mother had only one left tooth and how getting it fixed would cost the kind of money you prayed for in your pillow. He went to the address, an old warehouse with windows like black teeth, and walked into a living room the way you step into a photograph. There was a piano with dust on the keys, a whiskey decanter like a tiny planet that held a steady orbit, and a man who smelled like cedar and danger. The boss, the city had named him Angelo Romano in the papers. In the hubbub of cable news, he was a label, sat in a chair that had been built to hold men like him and watched Marco with an interest that was not entirely official. He had the medallion on his chest where it caught the light. He asked the question everyone asks in different words. "Are you afraid?" Marco lied because fear was a private tax. "I'm not," he said. The boss smiled, and the bones in his face seemed to illuminate. The medallion against the boss's chest, the tiny girl smiling in frozen time, and the quiet, terrible understanding that he had something small, literally small, in his hands that could shift a city. "You have a memory that belongs to someone else," the boss said. "I want it back." Marco took a breath. He thought about throwing it in the East River and telling the world he had never seen a man like this in his life. Instead he said, "I didn't find anything, must have been left behind." The boss's smile narrowed to a line. "You did, and someone saw you, someone with a camera." Marco's fingers dug into the pocket where the medallion warmed his thigh. He had no idea who had seen him. He had no idea how small things could be used like directions to a trap. The first reveal was small only because the world sometimes folds in stages. The medallion was not a child's trinket. It was a clue. The glass covering the photograph had been scratched in a way that revealed a thread inside, an engraved number that matched nothing in Marco's mind until a woman with a fan of hair and a badge called him in for coffee 2 days later. FBI. The city has a way of rerouting you through institutions when you least expect them. Agent Leela Dean had a voice built for interrogation and a compassion for the broken that made her the kind of person people confessed to in alleys. She called Marco because cabbies are the city's first drafts of truth. They see what other people think they're hiding. She showed Marco a picture on her phone, the medallion, the same photograph, and the scratched set of numbers. "Did you see this man?" she asked. "Do you know his name?" Marco shrugged and said what he always said. "Can't say as I do." He did not tell her about the hotel or the warehouse. The boss's presence was like a shadow that kept him honest by fear. Agent Dean slid a folded photograph across the table, a grainy snapshot of the hotel lobby. In the corner, a man watched the man with the medallion. Marco felt something cold in his chest when he saw the other man's face. An image of a face he had once known, Carlos Vega, a childhood neighbor who had disappeared into the city's underbelly a decade ago. Marco had seen Carlos at his mother's funeral, once in the background, older, harder. He had thought then that the city had swallowed everyone he loved. "You didn't know," Leela said. "You found it. You could have walked away." Her voice made his skin hot and still. "Do you know anyone who would keep a watch like that? A medallion?" Marco thought of his mother's chain that clicked when she prayed at night. He thought of the watch that had been his father's, that had stopped the day his father didn't come home. He said nothing. He wanted to be nowhere. He wanted to do the job and go home and not think. But the city does not hand you choices. It hands you inevitabilities. The second reveal, medium this time, came when he found the ledger. The ledger was not where anyone bets a ledger would be. It was hidden inside a false bottom of a piano bench in the warehouse, wrapped in plastic the way people wrap up secrets to make them smell like nothing at all. Marco didn't go looking for it. He went back to the warehouse to ask for more money and found the back room's loose floorboard and under it the ledger, heavy and thick, and smelling faintly of tobacco and blood. When he opened it, names bloomed like old wounds. Addresses, numbers, transfers, columns that pointed like a compass to bank accounts under names that were supposed to be dead or fictional. There were also photographs folded between the pages. Some of the girl from the medallion, some of men in suits, some of one particular watch engraved with the initials AR and a year. Marco felt the floor shift under him, like the city had moved for a second and he'd been left behind. He clutched the ledger like a prayer because the ledger meant money. It meant he could pay for his mother's care. It meant he could take the number off the wall for a while. He took the ledger to Agent Dean. She came in like a storm that wore a badge. Her team smelled of coffee and righteous fatigue. They pried the ledger, digitized the pages, and then sat Marco down and asked him a question nobody wanted to ask. "Why did you bring it to us?" He told the truth, partly, that he couldn't sleep with the weight of it in the seat beside him, partly that he wanted something to happen that did not depend on his wallet. The agent told him about money laundering, about shell corporations, about how people laundered grief into clean hands. She told him, finally, about legal immunity if he helped them bring in Angelo Romano. The ledger became the lever the FBI needed to pry open a lid that had been rusted shut for years. But the ledger was not the ledger alone. It was a bargaining chip, a target, and the moment you carry anything larger than a story in this city, you become prey. Marco's life narrowed to a set of choices that were not choices. Drive, deliver, hide, cooperate. His taxi became a moving vault. He kept the medallion in a sock in his apartment, folded into his underwear drawer. He kept the ledger under the bed, wrapped tight in the same plastic. He started sleeping with the lights on. He met with Leela in diners at 3 a.m., the kind of places where you could hear the city exhale between sugar packets. "You're not in this as a hero," she said once, sliding a photograph across the table like she used to slide evidence to other people. "You're in it because you have something they want. We can take them down, but you have to understand. They will come at you where it hurts." Marco nodded. He thought of his mother's hospital bed and the way she slept with her hands clenched, thinking she could hold her pain into neat shapes. He thought of his girl, his own daughter he saw once in a photograph he kept folded in his wallet, the watch his father had worn, the ring his aunt had lost in the Brooklyn docks. The FBI offered him a life jacket. He took it like a man who had almost given up swimming. Mid-story's twist arrived with a sound like a slamming door. A camera that had filmed the hotel's back entrance was analyzed, and the man who had watched Marco hand over the medallion was not a stranger. It was Detective Raul Mendoza of the NYPD, a man whose name on paper had always suggested a badge as bright as his conscience. The photo, enhanced, revealed Mendoza's face smudged by light and by something else, shame, perhaps, or calculation. The betrayal was a slap. It left its mark. Mendoza, a man who had once taken lunch with Marco's mother and joked about faith, had been on Angelo Romano's payroll for years. He had been the one watching the boss in the lobby and then watching Marco, reporting small movements to people whose fingered ledgers were, now, finally readable. The discovery of Mendoza inside the frame pushed the stakes beyond cash and tedious hospital bills. It meant the city's protective seams had been cut. The public safety orchestra had a rotten violin. When the betrayal broke, it made a noise that the city could hear. News vans lined the boulevard behind the FBI's unmarked cars. Editors with high collars and low, well-furnished egos called for statements. "We need your cooperation," Leela told Marco, and the voice of the public investigator in a televised hearing would be the last thing in Angelo Romano's sway if they played it right. The FBI set a date for a sting. Marco's role was simple on paper: be the bait. He would transport an envelope with fake transfers from a dead shell corporation to a secure location where agents could make a controlled arrest. He thought of the medallion and the girl and the ledger and the watch and the ring like stones in his pocket. He thought of his mother and the tired sleep she had. "I won't be the one who gets them," he told Leela in a diner the night before. "I'll make sure the city does." She looked at him as if to say maybe you will, maybe you won't, but she needed a man who would stand in the light. He agreed to stand. The ambush was not opera. It was a mechanical, cold event that smelled like rain and fear. Marco took the envelope and the medallion and the ledger and drove toward the meeting point. He had rehearsed the coward's lines in his head: what to do if the window shattered, how to keep his hands visible. A black SUV fell in like a shadow, and men with faces like scaled coins climbed out. The first shot was not intended for him. A light burst in the alley where the exchange was to happen, and then hands that had once belonged to government workers picked up guns and ammunition like they belonged in their palms. Marco's taxi became an island of danger. He saw a man drop, a life scatter like paper. He saw Agent Dean get thrown into the gutter. The ledger slipped from his grasp, and the medallion rolled out under the passenger seat, stopping like a patient heartbeat. He braked, then found himself dragged into a van, the smell of leather and sweat in the air, and the metallic click of a lock closing. No one had expected the betrayal to come from so many directions at once. He woke in a room that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, his hands tied to a chair, a fluorescent light humming overhead. The men who had him were lean, young, and patient. They spoke with the casualness of men who had rehearsed cruelty until it had a rhythm. "You don't know how this looks, Marcos," one of them said, as if using the wrong name would justify a wrong. "You've shown your face in places you shouldn't have." Their leader had a scar that ran like a question mark from ear to jaw. He held up the medallion like a stage prop. "This could have been his daughter's," he said. "This could be anything." Marco saw the man with the scar lean forward, and he watched his life become a coin someone could flip. He remembered a single line from his mother about the city. Sometimes it pays you back in ways you don't expect. He thought of the ledger, the lives folded into it like maps, and prayed for the feds to be competent. They wanted the ledger more than anything. Not the medallion, not the watch, not the sentimental photograph. The ledger was a list that could drag kings from their thrones. Marco lied because he still had the capacity to lie. He said he had burned it, that he had thrown it into the river like a responsible citizen. The man with the scar laughed the laughter of a man who has been lied to all his life. "We don't do burning," he said. We do ledgers. We lock them away. He turned on the radio somewhere in the room, and a talk show host interviewed a pundit about corruption. The irony was a flicker of light. They beat him only enough to send a message. They wanted to show him what the ledger would do to him. Empty his pockets, take his mother's teeth, and offer a telephone call that said, "Do you want to live?" He refused to give them what they wanted until a voice, soft, articulate, came through the speakers. It was the boss. "He gave it to you," the boss said. "You didn't have to keep it." Marco felt the room tilt. The voice through the speakers knew his name and his cab's medallion and his mother's odd superstition about locks. The boss couldn't be punished. He could be understood. When the raid finally came, because someone in the city still believed in alarms and the sanctity of wrists, it did not look like movies. It was a series of loud, efficient noises. The crash of a battering ram, the whine of a helicopter, the thump of boots. Men in black moved like punctuation. Agent Dean burst into the room he was held in, and the whole world rearranged for a moment around her efficiency. Marco did not understand how they had found him until later, when they showed him a grainy GPS on a laptop and Leela's face like a lighthouse. The men who took him were arrested with minimal drama. They had not expected the city's arms to move so fast. But Angelo Romano did not go gently. He was not there. He had already taken keys and made arrangements. He had a plan that ran like a river under the city. The hospital scene happened after the raid, a soft, terrible sequence that smelled of antiseptic and family prayer. Agent Dean hovered in the hallway with a cup of coffee and an exhaustion that looked more human than she allowed it to be. Marco sat at his mother's bedside, his fingernails still split from the ropes, and watched her breathe. She had been the one who had first bought him a toy taxi when he was small. She had been the first person to teach him how to park empathy next to a body at a hospital when the bills arrived. He had a bruise on his cheek from the beating and a quiet anger that settled in his stomach like a thing that would not be named. The news that night was not kind to cartel movies, and it made the city feel like a place that chewed on headlines. The boss had an alibi. The watch, his watch, the one the boss wore, was traced to another hand. The ledger was still missing a page. The pages had a habit of escaping when you wanted them most. In the hospital corridor, Angelo Romano walked in like a shadow stepping into light. He had blood on his cuff, not his own, and a pained expression no PR team could manufacture. He approached the nurse's station, and Marco watched him through the glass and recognized the weakness of men who had thought themselves untouchable. He saw the boss's hands tremble when he reached for a pamphlet about children's oncology, and he felt something unexpected: pity. The boss was not a god. He was a man with a child who might be bleeding in a room somewhere, and the face of that child was the same face in the medallion. Marco remembered the photograph and the freckle at the corner of her lip. The medallion was not about money, it said. It was about someone the boss thought he could buy back. In that corridor, the boss's mask slipped, and he made a sound like a man who had been told he had no control. He did not lash out with violence. Instead, he broke into a whispering torrent of apologies to a god that does not answer. The sight of him losing control was a violence all its own. This was the point where the third reveal began to unfurl. Not a small change, but a game changer that rearranged loyalties. The photograph tucked inside the medallion was not the boss's daughter. It was the daughter of a woman who had died in a fire 10 years earlier, a woman who had left the city with nothing but a name and a debt. The girl in the photograph, it turned out, had been living as the boss's ward. Hidden, protected, raised in a house with cameras and locked doors, taught never to speak of the city outside her garden. DNA from a hospital sample, taken when the girl's appendix had burst and the hospital did what hospitals do, matched a name from the ledger: Rivera. Marco's name. He had a child he had not known about. The ledger, the medallion, the watch, the photograph, the ring, all of them converged like 5 fingers around the handle of a single instrument. The ring had been found in a trash can outside a church, engraved with Marco's mother's initials. The watch had been traced back to a pawnshop run by a man who used to be Marco's uncle. The small things in his life connected like constellations. The city had drawn a map he was on without his consent. How do you hold your life when it has been rearranged by other people's mistakes? Marco learned that you could keep moving. He learned this by standing at a window and letting the city pass by like traffic. Leela told him the truth with surgical clarity. The ledger had name after name, and in the center were transfers to a hospital wing and a trust for a girl named Alina Rivera. She was alive. She had been safe, too safe, and in protective custody on paper that belonged to the boss. He had bankrolled her with money he had stolen from other people. She was his contraband angel. The revelation made Marco feel less like a man who had found a medallion and more like a center of a web he had never meant to be in. Anger and relief are not opposites. They are the same coin, minted with different faces. The interrogation scene, where betrayal fully revealed itself, did not take place in a courthouse, but in a small, fluorescent room where Detective Mendoza was sat across from Agent Dean and Marco. Mendoza's face had been through too many decisions. His freckles had become punctures of choice that bled guilt. He spoke in a voice like dry leaves. He told a story of debts and threats, and the kind of compromises people in his position make when the city hands them impossible choices. He had taken money, he confessed, not because he wanted to, but because his daughter's school had said they couldn't accept late payments anymore, and because Angelo Romano had a way of naming the things you need, and then giving them to you if you did as he asked. "I thought I was protecting my family," Mendoza said. His confession had a sound like a man who had been caught in a net. Marco watched him and felt the heat of a long-remembered childhood lesson. All of us bargain with our morals for the practicalities of living until we look back and the bargains have teeth. The ledger, when they finally found the hidden folder in a safe deposit box, did its job. Names were exposed. Bank accounts were frozen. The city wrote headlines about fallings from grace and the public meeting in which Angelo Romano viewed his own decline. He had enemies who had been waiting their whole lives for months like this to happen. The FBI had enough to indict, but the ledger had a page missing, the crucial page that detailed who had paid for what for the last 10 years. The missing page meant the boss could still trade. He could still threaten the family of a policeman with a school notice and call it leverage. The missing page was the third reveal's hinge. Without it, the case could be narrowed. With it, the case could be closed. It was here that the true stakes of the story became public and painfully personal. In the weeks that followed, Marco's life was an alternation of waiting rooms and streetlights, of voicemails that were both tender and terrifying. Alina's face haunted his rearview mirror. He thought of what fathers had done before him and what fathers could do now. He thought about revenge and about courtrooms and about the way violence slides into the heart of good intentions. Agent Dean sat him down and offered him an option that sounded like a promise and like a threat: testify in public. "You stand up there," she said, "and you tell them what you know, and you tell it plain." Marco thought of the man in the warehouse, of the scar, of the way the medallion had warmed in his pocket. He thought of his mother and the small kindness she had taught him. Don't move in anger. He agreed to go to court. The day Marco stood in the witness box, the courtroom smelled like glue and coffee and desperation. The cameras were there, and they wanted a show. The boss sat with a face as deliberately blank as a mask under a halogen sun. The boss's lawyer was a man who knew how to use a pause. Marco told the truth about the medallion and the ledger and the night with the warehouse. He told the court about Detective Mendoza and about how he had seen men move in black SUVs from the alley that night. The lawyer tried to make Marco look like the villain, questioned his credibility, reminded the court of the bruises, asked about his money troubles. Marco stood there like a man who had been stripped of theatrics. He said the word ledger. He said the word medallion. He said the word Alina. He looked at Angelo Romano and he felt something hot and clear and new. The face of his daughter in the photograph on the medallion, alive and unaware. The public response was savage and slow like a tide. The boss's jaw trembled. For the first time, the boss's control had been put on trial and found wanting. Concurrently, a high-action rescue took place, something agents rehearsed in concrete and then blurred with improvisation. Romano's runners tried to move Alina to a safe house. They were intercepted at a ferry terminal where the smell of salt and diesel was thick and where boats rocked like sleeping animals. Leela led the operation. Marco waited in a van, the medallion heavy against his chest. his knuckles whitening around a paper cup. The raid that followed was chaos, an eruption of trained men who moved with the precision of people who had rehearsed the worst. There was shouting. There were men thrown over railings. There was the sharp sound of a bottle breaking like a throat. Elena was found in a bathroom of a derelict building, clutching a stuffed rabbit like it held the secret to her survival. When she saw Marco, her face folded and then opened in a way that made him feel as though someone had decided to offer him a miracle. She did not speak for a full minute. She only stared. Then she put her small hand on his and whispered, "You look like him." It was almost more than his heart could bear. The boss, locked in a temporary holding cell before arraignment, did not maintain his mask. He sat on the metal bench and wept with a sound that surprised every watcher. It was not the sound of physical pain. It was the sound of a man whose cruelty had cost him the one soft thing he had tried to arrange. He had bought up surgeons and puppeteered headlines and taught a child to say please when dealing with strangers, and still it had not been enough. Watching a man like Angelo lose control is a strange thing. It is not satisfying in the way revenge is imagined. It is a human event, awkward and small, and it makes you wonder what it would cost to buy a child's silence. Marco saw the boss place the medallion on his lap, the photographs freckle visible. He imagined the boss remembering a night that had gone unpunished for decades, and he felt nothing like triumph. He felt the city as a place with many hands, some of them monstrous, and he felt the ledger as a thing that could open a lid or close a mouth. The climax unfolded in two movements, public and private. Publicly, the evidence from the ledger, the testimony from Mendoza's confession, and Alina's rescue combined to give prosecutors the kind of case that could unseat a dynasty. They filed indictments and announced charges on a Tuesday with press conferences and cameras that hummed like flies. The boss's empire had been built on small favors and cold threats. The ledger proved it. The bank accounts were frozen. Names that had been safe in shadow found themselves clubbed into the light. It was a legal victory, a closure for victims who had been told to keep quiet for years. Media calls came like rain. Marco's name trended for a week in feeds he did not have the stomach to read. Privately, the payoff was more complicated. Elena was reunited with a mother who was not Marco's, but who had the last name Rivera, who looked at Marco with suspicion, and then with an aching gratitude that made them both uncomfortable. DNA had bound them in the most biological of ways, and yet parenthood is not a single certificate in a file but 1,000 small decisions. Marco could have stood down and taken the money and left the city to its comfortable rot. Instead, he found himself in a child's small living room teaching her to make grilled cheese and to ride a bike with a helmet that looked too large on her head. He brought her to his mother's bed and watched them talk in ways that were crooked and human. The ring, his aunt's old ring, was cleaned and placed into a small box and given to Alina with a smile that was both his mother's and his. It was not a tidy ending. It was a life rearranged. In the weeks after the trial, Angelo Romano's defense grew theatrical. He attempted to trade names for a reduced sentence, to hand over smaller fish to the sea in exchange for his life. The ledger, however, had been distributed to a dozen prosecutors and backed up in data centers that could not easily be erased. The public grand jury moved with the slowness of something that will not be rushed by power. The city watched a powerful man fall the way a building with its foundation dissolved under water. Not one dramatic collapse, but a slow submergence that allowed people on the island to escape. Romano would later confess to a series of charges. He would refuse others. He would be sentenced to years behind glass and lights, and the city would, for a while, feel a little safer for it. Marco's mother's chemo worked for a season. They sold the old cab and bought a small car, and Marco learned how to drive it like a man discovering a new instrument. He hired an old friend as a mechanic. He took Alina to a school where the teachers had been told only a portion of the truth, and then let the rest emerge naturally, like sap from a tree. The ledger's missing page was never fully recovered, but prosecutors used other corroborations: bank statements, intercepted calls, witness testimony. They stitched together a mosaic. Piecing together the public record, Marco could see the threads. The medallion, the ledger, the photograph, the watch, the ring. all connected in a pattern that told a larger story about how people in power buy silence and how the city's small merchants barter their souls for survival. He could see, too, the cost of exposure. Lives that had been shielded were suddenly vulnerable, and vengeance is a dangerous fruit. At one public hearing, when the lights were sharp and the press smelled like lemons, Marco stood and looked at Angelo Romano. He did not look like a repentant man. He looked like a man who had been called into court and then found his own edges. Marco spoke without flourish. He spoke about a medallion and a photograph and how small things can change the fate of cities. He did not ask for pity. He asked for justice. The boss's face was a pale mask. When Marco walked out of that hearing, he felt like a man who had kept a promise to someone he had not known would exist. Months later, in a small apartment with a window that looked at a church, and a deli, Marco sat on a couch with Alina, and his mother and Agent Dean dropping by for coffee with the casualness that comes from having survived something together. The photograph from the medallion was framed on a shelf. Alina's rabbit sat beside it. The watch's engraving, AR 1998, was cleaned and locked away in evidence, but Marco kept a photograph of it on his phone. The ring had been returned to a family member who had once thought it lost. These objects had started as motifs. They had become the anchors of a life. He had been a taxi driver who said, "You forgot this," and returned a medallion to a man he did not know, and in doing so had set off a chain of events that would change more than his own family. There were nights when the city pressed close, and the old fear returned. There were times when he watched a car that stopped too long at the corner and felt the need to freeze. But those nights were fewer as months slid into years. Alina learned to speak of her past as a history she survived, and not a place she inhabited. She learned to call Marco Dad not as a label, but as a claim. Marco learned to say "I love you" in small, daily ways that were not cinematic but real. The way he fixed a loose wheel on a bike, the way he held her hand crossing a busy street. Agent Dean moved on to another job, but she would return with a birthday cake sometimes, and they would all eat cake in the living room and laugh a private laugh about the way the city had been schemed out and then restored in small ways. The public payoff, Romano's indictment, the arrests, the ledger's pages becoming public records, felt like something like closure. But the personal payoff was quieter, the slow knitting of a family that had nearly been shredded. Marco gave Alina a small brass medallion of her own, an heirloom of sorts, and she held it like a tiny planet. The objects that had once been clues and evidence were now tokens of things that had been redeemed: a photograph in a frame, a watch in a courthouse exhibit, a ring placed on a string and slipped into Alina's small palm. He taught her how to tie her shoes, how to respect people who had made mistakes, how to watch the city without wishing it away. He taught her that the ledger had been a list of sins and that people could be more complicated than papers could show. There was a final visit, almost ceremonial. Marco went back to the hotel where he had first handed the medallion to Angelo Romano. The bellhop remembered him, the marble still cool underfoot, the lobby still full of people who had never had to make the choices he had. He walked past a man with a briefcase who might as well have been a younger version of the boss, and he felt the gravity of his own small life. He placed a small bouquet at the edge of the curb, the sort the city sells by the light, and thought of how fragile and stubborn life can be. He whispered a word he had learned in the hospital corridor: forgiveness. He did not feel wholly redeemed. He simply felt able to be in the light. Years later, when the city's seasons had blurred and the newsreels had moved on, Alina graduated from a small college with a scholarship. She took the medallion to the stage and pinched it between her fingers like a talisman. Marco sat in the back with a cheap tie and a borrowed smile and watched his daughter's life happen as if it were the best possible present. The ring had been repaired and given to Alina as a promise of continuity, the photograph polished and placed in a frame in her dorm room. When she spoke at the graduation, she talked about resilience and about things you can pick up when you think you have nothing at all. Marco thought of that first night, of the medallion warm in his palm, of the way he had said "you forgot this," and handed it back like a small, honest act. He had no illusions about the city. He knew it ate good men and better plans. But he also knew that one small gesture can, sometimes, inside the pulsing of a restless burrow, change the coordinates of a life. In the end, the public case had its legal closures and its unfinished edges. The ledger's missing page was still a rumor in some alleys. The boss's empire had been diminished, but not erased. Marco's name was in files and press clippings, a footnote in a long city narrative. For him, the point was not the notoriety. It was the little things. The ring placed on a child's finger, a watch's engraving recontextualized into a family story, a photograph that meant that a girl now had a father who would stand for her in court. He kept driving on odd days, not for money, but because he liked the way streets told stories. He kept the medallion in a small box on a shelf, where sunlight hit it in the afternoon and made the photograph glow. "You forgot this," he told his mother one afternoon, handing her a small watchband he had found on a walk. She smiled in that soft way old people smile when they've lived through pain, and the city has been messy and unkind, but still offers small mercies. The watchband was meaningless, and then it was not. It was a reminder that sometimes the things we drop are anchors for other people. The ledger's pages would sit in court files and in the memos of prosecutors, a testament to the slow work of cleaning out rot. The photograph, Alina's face, remained the axis around which a family rebuilt. The medallion that had started it all was, in the end, not a thing that belonged to one man or another. It became a symbol of the way the city could be undone, and then stitched back with small, stubborn hands. Marco learned to sleep without the light on more nights than not. He learned that standing up to a man like Angelo did not mean becoming a monster. It meant choosing a different kind of courage. The city kept moving. Taxis changed into ride shares and back into taxis again like an old song's chorus. People forgot details and remembered others. But in a small apartment where a woman laughed at a joke and a grandfather clock chimed the hours, a father and a daughter lived with the echo of a decision that had started with a simple line and a copper medallion. Marco sometimes thought about how fragile heroism is, how it can begin with hesitation and a penny's worth of shame. And he thought about how the ledger had been a table where many hands had left their fingerprints. He thought about the times he could have chosen silence and how those times had not been quiet. In the quiet that settled after trials and articles and the hum of everyday life, Marco sat on his stoop and watched a child across the street drop a toy. He went to pick it up and return it, like a man who had learned to close small circles. The city sighed and resumed its business. He held the medallion for a moment in his hand before putting it back in its box. He thought of the boss and of how losing control had not been the end for him, only a new chapter. He thought of Agent Dean and Mendoza, and the ledger and the watch and the ring and the photograph, and how they had all been parts of a machine that, once started, could not be turned back. And then he turned the key in his little used car's ignition and drove away, toward a life that would bear the scars of exposure and the light of new days.